Today we're talking about the guilty verdicts in the Derek Chauvin trial, but also what it might mean for the greater push for changing police from reform to accountability to complete abolishment across the country. We have with us Jamiles Lartey. He is a staff writer for the Marshall Project. Jamiles, welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
So you've obviously been following the trial, and the jury came back pretty quickly after just 10 hours of deliberation. So what did you think when you heard their guilty verdicts?
Broadly speaking, I can't say I was surprised. I thought the prosecution did they dropped truckloads of context and experts, and I think they had what some legal scholars and some commentators have called, the mother of all evidence on their side, which was that video of George Floyd's death. And I think maybe that was a little bit hyperbolic, but at the end of the day, when you look at their closing arguments wasn't think about this expert that we showed you, think about that expert, think about this law that we read to you in great detail, right? Their argument was trust your eyes, trust your gut. It looked bad because it was bad. It looked like a crime because it was a crime. Like essentially their instructions to the jury was don't overthink this, and I think that's when you look at 10 hours of deliberation, I think that's what we got. I can't say that I was surprised. As a reporter, I'm not in the habit of making predictions publicly, but privately to myself and to friends and confidants and coworkers, I was pretty confident, even given all that we've seen in the past few years, that there was going to be a conviction in this case.
Right. And I guess we've been trying to think about how to think about this in that context that you just mentioned. So how uncommon is a conviction like this? And you obviously mentioned the fact that there was video evidence that the world had seen. So did it have to do with the attention on the case overall, the evidence, the prosecution, or basically, a combination of all of that?
That's a good question. It's pretty uncommon for use of force, for an intentional use of force on the job. I don't have that number in front of me. I apologize, but I believe it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 or 7 officers, dating back about 10 years, maybe 15 years actually. I think that number goes back to 2005. So, right, it's extremely uncommon. Generally speaking, when police are prosecuted, it is for actually disproportionately it is for traffic accidents, believe it or not, that where they were doing something irresponsible while driving, or sometimes police are convicted of crimes that maybe it happened with their service weapon, but they weren't acting as a police officer at that time. So there's a handful of convictions in those cases, but generally speaking, police officers are not tried and are not convicted for using force on the job of being a police officer. So it was pretty uncommon in that sense. And there have obviously been plenty of cases where there was video, there was a lot of public attention, and there was in turn no indictment, or if even if the cop was charged, there was no guilty verdict, and we've seen that in a number of cases. I did cover one of the few cases where a police officer was convicted of a crime in an on-duty shooting, the Peter Liang Akai Gurley case in New York, and that is the other sort of most likely way that these cases happen, that a police officer is convicted is when it's basically unintentional. Right. In that case, Peter Liang's argument was that his finger had slipped. He didn't mean to shoot Akai Gurley. He didn't even see Akai Gurley. Right. Akai Gurley was down the stairwell. So police can sometimes be convicted when their actions are just irresponsible. Right. But it's exceedingly and vanishingly difficult to convict a police officer for an intentional use of force while on the job of being a police officer.
And people were celebrating around the country after the verdict, but we should check that emotion, because when we last talked in early March, you said if Chauvin was convicted, that doesn't mean justice. Let's take a listen.
A single police officer being convicted of a police killing doesn't really set, like, it's happened before. It happened in the Walter Scott case. The officer, Michael Slager, accepted a plea deal on federal charges. It didn't change the landscape. It's happened before in other cases. It didn't change the landscape. Like, the overwhelming fact remains that the system as it's currently designed is not designed to hold police criminally accountable for killing people while on duty.
What would it take for the landscape to change?
Not a criminal trial, right? I mean, a criminal trial is inherently an action taken about one particular interaction between a police officer and a citizen, and it imparts justice or accountability, depending on which term and which framework you prefer. We've heard both in the last day, on one person. It is not an indictment or a conviction of a system. It is not an indictment or a conviction of a department, of an organization. So I would say it depends what you're looking for. I mean, what we can say is that outside of the specific context of this trial, if we think about this as a post George Floyd moment, over 30 states have passed more than 140 new police oversight and reform laws, according to an analysis that the New York Times did over the weekend. So, 16 of those were bills that explicitly ban the kind of hold that that Derek Chauvin had George Floyd in.
Yeah.
That language that they had in Minnesota used to be ambiguous. And that was something that me and my colleague Simone Weichelbaum reported on shortly after Floyd's killing. That language is not ambiguous anymore, right? So that's a change. That's different.
Yeah.
And it's sort of, I leave it to the listener, and I leave it to citizens and people who are paying attention to this to decide whether or not that's enough.
Right. And on the federal level today, the U.S. Justice Department announced it is launching this broad investigation into Minneapolis PD, including the policies and tactics that it uses. That's on top of the current DOJ investigation into whether Derek Chauvin violated George Floyd's civil rights. What does this news signal to you about how the White House is taking this issue of police accountability here?
Yeah, and not to be cynical, it doesn't signal a ton to me. Or I guess I would say it's exactly what I would expect for an administration, that has looked to bring people like Kirsten Clark and Vanita Gupta into their Department of Justice, and has promised to reinvigorate these patterns and practices, investigations into police departments where problems turn up, right? So in the context of, if you think about the Biden administration or the Biden Justice Department as somewhat of a continuation of the Obama era Justice Department, you look at the work they did in Ferguson with the Ferguson report, the work they did on other patterns and practices, investigations into other police departments, I would say it's sort of roughly par for the course, right? This is what a Democratic-led Department of Justice has done in response to high-profile police violence since at least 2014, right? Since Ferguson.
Right. And then sort of going beyond this trial, a number of communities around the nation have tried making various steps. You were sort of alluding to this, that try to rein in police powers or at least make them more accountable. We were mentioning, language in Minnesota law. We were mentioning, some of those other specific reform efforts around chokeholds. But can you tell us about some of the more ambitious efforts that we've seen here?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of the more ambitious efforts, you look to a place like Colorado, where they've taken on this question. There's this term that I'm sure you're familiar with. I'm sure a lot of your listeners are familiar with, qualified immunity, right. Which is a fairly misunderstood phenomenon. And you'll probably see some headlines that have said that Colorado abolished qualified immunity or something to that extent, which is really mischaracterizing it. What they did is they made it possible for citizens to sue an individual police officer for violating their civil rights under state law. Now that's ambitious. That is, you know, I think it's hard to describe that as anything other than ambitious when you look at exactly how generous the court, especially the federal courts specifically, have been in expanding the protections of qualified immunity to police officers and actually to actors throughout the Justice Department. They've also extended it to prison guards in a lot of pretty unseemly and horrendous cases.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, I would call that ambitious. I think a lot of city councils have tried things that are ambitious or have endeavored to try things that are ambitious, which is to say they've passed things, they've started things, they've had the conversation, and we have yet to see reap the fruit from the sowing of those seeds. So I think the jury kind of remains out. Like, we don't know what the net impact of all of these cities, for example, that are committing money to have civilian responders or civilian co-responders go to certain mental health calls or certain calls of people facing unhoused people. Different efforts like that, I think, are ambitious, and we just have to see where they wind up, right? I mean, the Minneapolis City Council was very ambitious in essentially, declaring it was going to dissolve its police department, and that ambition was for naught. So I think we have to keep watching before we can make conclusions about what all of that ambition will get us. What I'd also say in terms of some of these policy changes is that the police have a long history of changing policies. In the early 1990s, the LAPD were told that they couldn't choke people out with their aluminum batons anymore. That's a way that they used to, gain compliance from people, is take the aluminum baton and bring it across somebody's windpipe. Jeez. And so a few years later, we have the Rodney King beating, sort of the first viral video of a Black American being beat by the police or severely injured and harmed by the police. And one of the arguments that the officers made was that they had to beat him so violently because they weren't allowed to do this. They weren't allowed to chokehold him, so they just had to beat him with batons to get him under compliance. Right now, here's another example. Fast forward several decades, everyone saw George Floyd under Derek Chauvin's knee, which is a type of control of an arrested person that has been kind of going out of favor in recent years. This really sped it up, obviously. But police departments, and going back to Eric Garner, really anything around the neck or windpipe has been under scrutiny, under close watch, and has been, being pushed out of police procedure. So let's go to the case of Daniel Prude in Rochester, New York.
Right.
Now, the officers in that case were specifically utilizing the new version of gaining someone's compliance that they had been taught to not have to go to their neck, go to their windpipe, do anything close to choking. And it's something called segmenting. Basically, the idea is that officers divide the arrested person's body into segments, and one person will try to control their head, another person will try to control their upper body, another person will try to control their lower body. And by dispersing the force among three officers and three separate parts of the body, you're using less force in any one particular place. It's going to be less harmful. Well, that still wound up in a person dying in police custody using this new cutting edge solution. I'm not, and I want to be clear here, I'm not saying that there are not going to be some methods of arrest or gaining compliance that aren't going to be safer than others.
Right.
I'm saying that as long as the police are arresting people and using force on people they deem to be a threat, there's never going to be a perfect answer here. Like, it's all going to be variations on something that still has the potential to cause physical harm, cause serious injury, and cause death.
Right. They will seemingly find any possible way to navigate around whatever protocols are altered. Going back to Minnesota for a second, we heard a lot of, statements from folks like Attorney General Ellison and others about the community. So what role did protesters on the local level play in sort of keeping pressure on officials throughout this process so that they followed through on, both how they were pursuing the prosecution and overall, thinking through this kind of accountability?
That is a really good question that I think is almost impossible to answer, because conceptually, the more influence that protesters and public attention had on the trial, the more grounds that Derek Chauvin would have to appeal his conviction. So I don't think any of the people who were involved, they will, the Keith Ellisons and, of the world, they will sort of broadly concede that, they're public officials and that they were seeking justice on behalf of a community that had a right to be angry and aggrieved. But in terms of this specific case, I don't think that's something that anyone there is going to really admit to, because admitting to that throws the impartiality and the fairness of the prosecution into question if it starts to sound like they were basically bowing to public influence, and that's the reason why they prosecuted, not because of what the law says.
Right. You would run into, the defense attorney trying to, get a mistrial in more ways than he already did. And to this sort of question about kind of what happens if police are the people that are meant to hold other police accountable. We have seen basically in every situation, police don't want to be police themselves. Many unions close ranks to try and stop efforts that make them accountable. In the face of public pressure, is that wall, if you will, going to continue to hold up?
Yes and no. I think we're seeing, so I would point you to, I think there was a really fantastic op-ed article in the Washington Post that I think it probably came out this morning. The headline was, "I'm a cop. The Chauvin verdict is a message for me and for my colleagues." The subheading is, "Police officers can't be defensive. We owe it to those we serve to change policing and slow down." I thought that was a really fantastic column and way of thinking through what some of the broader implications of this trial would be for the profession. I think there have been cracks in the thin blue line, in the circle the wagons at all costs motto and motif, right? I think we have in the last year and again in the last 5 years seen more of a willingness of some officers, particularly officers of color, but not exclusively, to question some of the some of the accepted standards, some of the cultural norms of the profession, and to say, hey, we need to make a change. I think this will maybe catalyze that a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think institutions and organizations trend towards self-preservation.
Right.
And I don't think that's a police thing. I think that's just a human organizational thing. And so I think the overwhelming energy will remain the same, even if you have more defectors. And I know I almost hesitate to use a word like defectors, right? Because I don't think you're defecting as a, like me personally, I don't think it is. I would not consider it a defection for a journalist to come out and say, we as media and as journalists need to be more accountable to our readers and need to address some of the harms that we've caused, right? Like
Right.
I see that as positive and productive.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of using that term with like air quotes around it, because that is the dynamic that has been set up in this industry and in this profession, which is to say policing, that anyone who questions it, anyone who steps outside, anyone who's willing to speak this way is not, a part of the true brotherhood and sisterhood of the thin blue line.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think defector is right in a sense, because that is the culture that has been created. And President Biden was sort of alluding to part of this yesterday when he suggested that there were some, good cops who kind of testified against a bad cop, Derek Chauvin. And I guess this would depend on who you ask, but does that sort of good cop versus bad cop dichotomy that is kind of set up by some of the testimony that we saw in this trial distract people from this bigger problem, which is sort of the standards by which officers can be held accountable?
Yeah, I mean, the prosecution's argument essentially relied on this kind of bad apple theory.
Right.
And it wasn't again, it's so important to keep in mind. This was not a trial. American policing was not on trial. Derek Chauvin was on trial. That's something that the prosecutors were quick to remind people of, for a number of reasons. For one, because, they don't have the authority to prosecute American policing. For two, I think it was probably important in terms of their efforts to try to secure a conviction. I think they had to give jurors who may have some inherent deference to law enforcement a bit of an emotional out there to, where they could convict and not feel like they were compromising the fact that they, in the abstract, support police or policing or don't want to abolish all police.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, I'd say this, right? It is true that in a country with about 1 million police officers, some will be better and worse than others in terms of their ethics, their training, their commitment to their craft, their level of the personal demons that they bring to the job. And again, that will be true of journalists, of teachers, of construction workers, and of the rest of the village people, right? So it's not, I would say it's not, we can, on the one hand, and I'm going to stretch this metaphor here into oblivion, so forgive me.
No, go ahead.
We can talk about, if we have a barrel of apples, we can talk about how we're picking them, and we can talk about how we're monitoring to make sure that they're not becoming spoiled and making the whole barrel go bad. And then we can also simultaneously have a conversation about having a balanced diet. Why are we so apple heavy? Would we be better off with some oranges and some bananas in our bowl? And there's no reason why we can't sort of talk about the barrel that we have and talk about the barrels that we don't have. One does not preclude the other.
I don't know if you have tried that out before or thought through that metaphor before, but I'm going to give you credit for introducing it here for the first time on the fly. It was great.
I try.
I liked it a lot. One other sort of important lesson among many in all of this is sort of the role of bystanders, particularly, in actually monitoring police. I don't think that we would be in this situation if then 17-year-old Darnella Frazier didn't film Floyd's death, share it with the world, correct the narrative first told by police, actually erase that narrative and replace it, because that initial statement didn't tell us anything about what actually happened. So how important is it that bystanders keep records on police that go beyond their own reports and even their own body cameras?
Yeah, it's obviously invaluable in this case and has been invaluable in other cases. Again, not always in securing a criminal conviction, but even in cases where that didn't happen, in secure, right? I mean, try to go back to, obviously we didn't have video of Michael Brown, but think about all of the cases in the aftermath of Ferguson, as this movement was reborn and revitalized over and over again, and revitalized feels like such a unfortunate term to use when what we're talking about is, Black Death. But so many of these moments that captured national attention, that galvanized people, that pulled people off of the sidelines and pulled them into this conversation, whether we're talking about Philando Castile or Eric Garner, or there's so Walter Scott. The list goes on and on. It's hard to I'm trying to like do the counterfactual exercise in my head of thinking, if there'd been videos of none of these, how much of all of this would have happened and not happened, how much of this conversation would still have taken place and would not have taken place. And it's hard to imagine the world looking the way that it does now,
right,
without the either the emotional resonance of people just seeing things and sort of living in that moment, living in that experience for themselves, or just having it as an evidentiary, right, as just a strictly clinical matter to rebut the narratives of law enforcement. Between the value of those two, I think it's almost impossible to overstate.
Yeah. Well, Jamiles, thank you so much again for taking the time and being so generous with it. We always appreciate talking to you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been a privilege. Thanks for having me.